Hi, I'm Hugo Bown Anderson, and welcome to High Signal. Today, I'm super excited to be speaking with Chiara Farronato, the Glenn and Mary Jane Kramer Associate Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Chiara's research focuses on the economics of digital platforms and innovation, with a particular emphasis on peer-to-peer marketplaces like Airbnb and Uber. Chiara is also co-principal investigator of the Platform Lab at Harvard's Digital Data Design, that's D3, Institute. So in this episode, Chiara and I explore how platforms have transformed the way businesses operate, and we focus on the challenges of managing these platforms, especially in fostering collaboration between managers and data scientists. We dive into the communication gaps between technical and non-technical teams and what it takes to build a data-driven culture that drives meaningful change. So Chiara offers so many insights into bridging the communication gap between managers and data scientists, the importance of building a data-driven culture in organizations, and the future of management education in an AI-driven world. If you're managing or working with data science teams, I believe this conversation will give you a lot to think about. To set the stage, I asked Chiara, what are the most important things that managers and business leaders should know about communicating with technical people?
Both data scientists and managers need to understand that there is ultimately a lot of discretion in data science, right? It's not just pushing a button and let an algorithm work. And so having a clear understanding of the ultimate goal actually will allow them to implement and use that discretion to achieve that same objective.
Next, Chiara dives into a fascinating case study from Uber, where engineers, data scientists, and product managers come together in trip parties to collaborate on individual trips simulated by their algorithms.
That's the fundamental trade-off. Make your product efficient so that you can make a profit, but also delivering high value to your customers so that they decide to actually take it. And there's an example in the case where engineers, data scientists, and product managers sit in these very tight sort of conference rooms in what they call trip parties, where they would look right at individual trips that were simulated through these new algorithms and would decide together what kind of trips were acceptable and what kind of trips were not acceptable. And so these trip parties were a way for these three sets of people to have a common ground over what the product needed to achieve.
And finally, Chiara shares an example of the difference between a statistical and intuitive way of communicating technical concepts. She uses a great example involving treatment and control interference in ride sharing.
Yep. So let me give you a very concrete example of a statistical way of talking about, for example, treatment and control interference, and a much more intuitive way of talking about it. The statistical or technical way of talking about treatment and control interference between experimental units is violations of SUTVA, stable unit treatment value assumption, which fundamentally all it does is what is this assumption is each unit of observation in your experiment need to be independent of one another.
Mm.
Now, that's a technical thing. What does it mean concretely? I divide the class into two groups of passengers, right? To half of them, I give a 50% discount on their price of rides. To the other half, I don't. And I tell them that they are actually all requesting rides, right, in the same location. Now, I asked the people who got the discount, what is your likelihood, right, to pick a ride, to order a ride when you're faced with such a large discount? And the answer is obvious. You are going to be more likely to request a ride because now it's way more convenient for you to do so. Well, now I move to the other half of the class and I say, now you are requesting rides. How many cars are going to be available for you to be driven to the places where you want to go? The first group is going to deplete all the supply, leading to a reduction in the availability of cars for the second group. That reduction is going to push the probability to the request a ride lower. And so the first group is interfering with the ability of the second group to actually request a ride. And that creates a bias in the difference in the propensity of the two groups to request a ride that is induced by this interaction.
Mm.
And that makes it much clearer. The students don't have to go back home and go and understand what sutva means. They have a very intuitive understanding of what that problem is.
Now, before we jump into the full conversation with Chiara, let's take a quick moment to chat with the folks at Delphina who help make High Signal possible. All right, I'm here with Jeremy and Duncan, the co-founders of Delphina and producers of High Signal. Hey guys, maybe you can tell us a bit about what Delphina does and why we're doing this podcast.
Awesome. Thanks, Hugo. At Delphina, we're building agents for data science. And we've noticed there's a lot of noisy advice in data science. By nature of our work, we speak with a lot of interesting people in the space. And so we're looking to identify and share the high signal.
Very cool. So we're about to jump into the full interview with Chiara from Harvard Business School, but we just played a clip and I was wondering what in there resonated with both of you.
So first, for me, what resonated was the idea of working in cross-functional groups for data science. And one of the sort of patterns and anti-patterns I've seen at Uber and elsewhere is that generally science projects are the most successful when the scientist is embedded in the business team or in the product team. We saw this over again at Uber. An anecdote at Uber was one of the first models we tried to get off the ground when the company had very little machine learning in production was a churn model for Uber drivers. And a centralized science team built a model and published the churn predictions out to the warehouse and just hoped that the ops team would use it to try to retain drivers that were at risk of churning. But without a team and a product manager owning those predictions as a product, they were never actually used, and gradually the product rotted on the vine and wasn't used. And contrast that with one of the early big successes at Uber, which was using machine learning to predict or correct the Uber ETAs. In that case, a data scientist in the Maps team recognized that they could use machine learning to make much, much better ETAs for Uber. And that's core to Uber's product experience and drives pricing. And that project was a huge success because the science team was embedded deeply within the product team.
Wonderful context. And particularly, as we know, Chiara did focus on an Uber case study, which Duncan was involved in, actually. So without further ado, let's jump into the interview. Thank you for your time. Hey there, Chiara, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Hugo. Thank you for having me.
Such a pleasure. So you've spent a long time studying the growth of digital platforms and the challenges they face. I'm wondering if we could start off by you sharing what drew you to this space and how you think digital platforms are evolving today.
Yeah, absolutely. I ended up studying platforms a little bit by chance, I have to admit, because I found myself in the right spot at the right time. I started my PhD at Stanford in 2009 when many of these digital platforms were popping up in Stanford's backyard. Airbnb, Uber were all being founded right there, right then. And confidentiality risks were not an issue at the time. So these companies were actually willing to share some of their data to work with academics and learn from analysis that academics may do of their marketplaces. And so that's how I got started. I initially got data from TaskRabbit, which was a platform for errands, for running errands. The biggest service was IKEA furniture assembly at the time. And so you would pay to get your IKEA furniture assembled by somebody else. We got data with Andre Fratkin from Airbnb, and we started studying the value that Airbnb created in the accommodations market by allowing for flexible supply of rooms to come in a market where demand was highly fluctuating. And I really got passionate about understanding their market design choices, how they grow. And now that they've grown big, what kind of regulatory challenges they pose. And so, to your question about what is their evolution today, I think it is very clear that they have helped society with a lot of value, right? They've created a lot of value for society. They personalize offerings. They make available options that wouldn't have been otherwise available in the offline world. They lower entry barriers so that new service providers can come in and start provide services to people. Now that may be a double-edged sword because you have new entrants into these markets, right? New, maybe less professional entrants into this market, but how do you monitor the quality and protect consumers from risky transactions? Well, you do it with very frequent ongoing monitoring through online reputation mechanisms, through tracking from the platforms themselves of service quality metrics and so on. They've allowed workers to have a much more flexible schedule. I'm thinking about Uber drivers, for example. Flexibility of work schedules is something that is very rare among certain segments of the population. And so some of these platforms have allowed for people who require, right, flexible hours because they care for kids, because they care for elderly, to have that option. And then they are platforms that allow supply also to respond to variability in demand. And so when you have high fluctuating demand, think about rush hours for taxis or peak seasons for hotels. You now have this flexible supply that come in when it's most needed, which is unlike traditional service providers. Taxis, they work full time or half a day, regardless of the peaks in demand. And hotels are always available 365 days a year, regardless of travel peaks and troughs. Now, the question is how that value is being distributed, right? And are these platforms capturing too much of this value? And my research is now focusing really on using experimental analysis to try and understand whether that value capture comes at the expense of the utility that they create for consumers and service providers.
Thank you so much for that context. Something you reminded me of, and so something we'll link to is a way people can get some of your case studies, including the Uber case study for a lot of their experimentation and certain products they rolled out. But to your point, the fact that you are able to go into these big tech companies and see what was happening on the inside is something that happens less and less. And I haven't thought about this in some time, but years ago I read The Concept of the Corporation by Drucker, right?
Mhm.
And he went into General Motors for a long time, right? And wrote a book based upon this. And I think we have less and less transparency into the big organizations that impact our lives. So all I'm saying there is that your work it is incredibly important for everything happening. I do think there are also a variety of externalities, right? Such as, sure, such services allow flexibility for workers, but they don't necessarily provide the support that workers need, such as insurance in somewhere like the United States where you live and I used to live. Something I hope to get to in your Uber case study is you paint a fascinating scene of the different minds and skill sets that come together in order to perform this rapid experimentation. I don't want to dive into all those skill sets yet and personas, but I do want to first talk about the communication divide between managers and
Yep.
data scientists. And you, of course, teach data science for people at Harvard's Business School who want to be going into management, right? And you've talked a lot about how critical it is for managers and data scientists to communicate effectively, yet they struggle. So what strategies have you found most effective for bridging that gap in organizations?
Yeah, I think there's some key strategies. And by the way, before going that, all you have said about the externalities that these platforms create, absolutely true. And parts of the reason why there's no transparency on that is because companies don't want, right, for you to come in and study their operations in a way that maybe creates sort of regulatory challenges. And academics need to study this knowing that companies will not want to open their doors for those kind of questions. And I've thought about that a little bit. But going back to the communication between managers and data scientists, I think the status quo is one where these two groups speak two different languages, like a very technical language and a very intuitive language. And we need, at the education level, we need to bridge the gap between these two fundamentally different languages. And what that means is that on the side of the managers, us as professors in MBAs, we need to teach them some of the vocabulary that data scientists use, some of the techniques that data scientists use, but at the same time, I encourage sort of data science schools, that masters in data science, to do also the other translation exercise of trying to teach data scientists not to speak in a statistical way, but to speak in a very intuitive way. The other important thing to make communication easier is to really understand that despite the fact that they come from different fields, they have a common objective, right? When they work together at a company, and they want to make the product better, right? Maybe even their financial incentives need to be aligned so that they really are pushed to work together to achieve a common goal. And then I think the one of the other big key factors is that both, right, data scientists and managers need to understand that there is ultimately a lot of discretion in data science, right? It's not just pushing a button and let an algorithm work. And so having a clear understanding of the ultimate goal actually will allow them to implement and use that discretion to achieve that same objective.
Awesome. So at Harvard Business School, you have a data science course for MBA students. As we said, how do you approach teaching managers data science concepts and statistical concepts, for example, particularly when they're not looking to become such technical people themselves?
Yeah, I think the way you framed your question is actually key, right? Because we're not teaching managers to become data scientists. That's for somebody else to do. So the final objective is not to teach them statistics, but to teach them ways in which they can work effectively with data scientists and engineers. And what that means in practice for managers is to ask the right questions and, importantly, understand the answers that they get from their partners, right? What that means also is to understand the possibilities that technology can provide. And we've seen in the last few years how technology has changed so dramatically. So inevitably, what we're teaching today is not going to stay fixed, stationary for the next few decades, where our managers are going to be making an impact into practice. And so we want to teach them in a very flexible way how to understand, how to learn the possibilities that technology can provide. And what that means is teaching them the value of the scientific method, which requires them to admit not knowing the answer to questions. And that's why they rely on data, they rely on external sources to obtain that answer. We also want them to understand how to effectively complement domain knowledge and data insights, because a lot of the data, because of the discretion that can be used in shaping the data, can almost give rise to any results. And so you need to be able to use judgment to understand, right, the authenticity of the answer that you get from this data. And so those are some of the objectives that we have in mind when we teach this course that is now become required to all our MBAs at HBS when we teach this course.
Awesome. And to be honest, I think we touched upon this last time we spoke, but the mindset isn't that different to what business leaders and managers of tradition, like good business leaders have been fantastic experimentalists, fantastic at trying things, pivoting, moving back and forth. Uber has done a lot of these switchback experiments. Business leaders for decades, if not beforehand, were doing similar things, not as robust and statistical and cloud native and all of these types of things. But something I'm also hearing in there, and so I've spent a lot of time educating data scientists, or teaching, educating sounds, but so the way I've always framed it is data scientists need to be able to speak the language of business. And what we're talking about here is kind of the inverse, what managers need to be able to speak. But I always tell budding data scientists that you have business questions and you want some sort of business solution. And perhaps you want to factor that through a data science question and get a data science answer, but you want that still to come back to a business answer. You don't want to go back
Always.
to your head of growth and say the statistical significance was, unless they want to get into the technical weeds. So I'm wondering, the other direction, what are some practical steps managers who are listening can take today to improve their communication with data scientists and better leverage data in decision making?
Yeah, I think they need to take some technical classes. That's actually very important. And many of the business schools that they'll attend will have cross-listed courses with more like with the engineering school, for example, in their universities. This means also getting their hands dirty with some analysis of data, really trying it yourself. They don't have to be fancy, but they can give it a try. And actually, tools like ChatGPT make it a lot easier because you can have a code interpreter, which is now integrated in ChatGPT, really help you walk through the steps of the analysis. This requires you to have very clear in mind what are the steps of the analysis for the purpose of the managerial problem that you're trying to solve. And then really surround yourself with technical people. So, for example, if you want to be an entrepreneur, make sure you have a technical co-founder if you are not the technical co-founder yourself.
So jump in, don't be afraid to get some technical chops and try to understand the language of the people you're talking with. Leverage generative AI currently to do that stuff. Speaking of which, actually, I'm staying at a friend's place currently. She has a copy of Never Split the Difference, the Chris Voss book, the negotiation book. And I got ChatGPT the other day to simulate some like crisis communication situations and talk me through them. And I felt like I was at business school in a variety of ways. It was fascinating. And I got to do it in increasing levels of difficulty. So the things you can get it to do are pretty
It's
incredible.
impressive. I have a good friend who's not tech savvy, but she's a product manager in a digital transformation initiative. And she was literally asking me yesterday, how do I upskill myself, particularly in SQL? And some of the suggestions that I gave her was really like have ChatGPT help you generate a data set, help you generate an analysis that allows you to really get a sense what SQL really allows you to do. Fundamentally, it's a data retrieval tool, but for somebody who's not tech savvy, can be very scary. And I think we now have the technology to make those tools less scary and more usable.
I couldn't agree more. I'd now love to jump into some of your case studies, in particular, your Uber case study. I'm wondering if you could share the key lessons from that case, especially in terms of how managers, data scientists, engineers, and product managers, of course, work together in order to make decisions, essentially, but based upon the rapid experimentation that you saw at Uber in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me tell you first a little bit about the case so that we have a sense of what is the key dilemma there. And by the way, these case studies, we use them to teach, right, with the case method at Harvard Business School. And it's a very effective way to get people, students, to see a very practical problem with a solution or a set of discussions that are hopefully generalizable to a broader set of context that they will hopefully experience in their future. So Uber at the time of the case had a pool product. Now with COVID, we've almost forgotten about it. But with the pool product, passengers would share rides with other passengers going in similar direction at normally a lower price than regular Uber. Yeah, the problem, right? If they were not matched, they would still pay the low price, and Uber would be left holding sort of the higher cost of the ride. And so you need to have a very thick market to make this product work. And in practice, there were rarely valuable matches between riders available, so the product was actually losing money. So the case discusses Uber's initiative to make the product profitable without hurting, right, customer experience too much. And so they set on creating an alternative where people could walk to pick up to their pickup from their drop off and wait to be matched, right? So more of waiting and walking would allow for more matches to be made. But passengers, you can guess, right? We obviously not like it. We were talking about it a bit earlier, right? It felt like Uber was reinventing sort of public transportation, where you walk to a station and you have to wait for the bus to show up, right?
And something you and I also discussed was how the results could be geographically related, right? Because I was living in New York at the time, you're up in Boston, Harvard, and So in the Northeast in winter, you don't want to walk one block, let alone two, whereas perhaps in California in summer, it's chill.
Absolutely. And so the key of the case is, how do you set those parameters? How do you make people walk? How long do you make them walk? And how long do you make them wait? Do you make them wait 2 minutes? Do you make them walk 1 block, 2 blocks? And there's a lot of heterogeneity in the feasibility of these different parameters. But so that's the key dilemma of the case. Now, we use that case to teach some technical objectives, right? How do you use, for example, different data sources, survey, simulations, experimentation to innovate? And how do you choose among different experimental designs as a function of risks of treatment and control interference, which we can go deeper in, but it's a big problem in marketplace experimentation. But in your question, you pointed out the teamwork between managers, data scientists, and engineers. And it was fascinating to learn while we were conducting, right, these interviews, how closely these three figures were really working towards, as we talked about before, towards that common objective of creating a profitable product that doesn't annoy customers, right? That's the fundamental trade-off. Make your product efficient so that you can make a profit, but also delivering high value to your customers so that they decide to actually take it. And there's an example in the case where engineers, data scientists, and product managers sit in these very tight sort of conference rooms in what they call trip parties, where they would look, right, at individual trips that were simulated through these new algorithms, through these new sort of parameters, and would decide together what kind of trips were acceptable and what kind of trips were not acceptable because they may cause too many sort of weird routing of an individual passengers, or they may have a passenger wait way too long in a place where it wasn't acceptable. And so these trip parties were a way for these three sets of people to have a common ground over what the product needed to achieve. And it's hard to achieve that because oftentimes data scientists, engineers, and managers are siloed into an organization. But actually having them work very physically tightly together was very effective and beautiful to learn about.
Absolutely. And I just want to read you something from your case study because it is a fascinating example that I think really demonstrates your point where, so to be clear, there's a tension or a trade-off between how long people have to wait or walk and how efficient the trips are, how many people can get transported at one point in time, and these types of things. And one product manager in the room was like, oh, people have to wait. We can't make them wait. Another product manager was like, actually, maybe if they wait a bit longer, everything's more efficient, we make more money, everyone's happier. And then Duncan Gilchrist, who was head of data science for Uber's rider pricing and marketplace experimentation teams. To be totally transparent, Duncan is also a wonderful producer of this podcast. But Duncan, in his wonderful diplomacy, replied, I understand both your points. I love that opening as well, telling people, I understand both your points, but these results are just from a few neighborhoods in Boston. We have no way to validate them in other cities. So perhaps doing some more experimentation is key. And I think this is something that's so important, is recognizing when you have enough results, when it's time to experiment further. And the fact that in your work, you've broken it down into helping managers understand that you've got surveys, you've got simulations, you've got experiments, and how to think about these different types of things. And I'll actually link to a video that is on YouTube of you talking about teaching data science with the case method. But something you mentioned in there, which I just love, that I just want a bit more context around, because we're making it sound like perhaps managers do need to become more technical. And I'm not saying they don't, but you make clear the final objective is not to teach statistics. And you also say you can talk in a statistical way or an intuitive way. So while we're getting managers to become more technical, we also don't want them to think that statistics is the be all and end all, right?
Yep. So let me give you a very concrete example of a statistical way of talking about, for example, treatment and control interference, and a much more intuitive way of talking about it. The statistical or technical way of talking about treatment and control interference between experimental units is violations of SUTVA, stable unit treatment value assumption, which fundamentally all it does is, what is this assumption is each unit of observation in your experiment need to be independent of one another. Now, that's a technical thing. What does it mean concretely? And we use the sort of concrete intuitive example in the case. I divide the class into two groups of passengers, right? To half of them, I give a 50% discount on their price of rides. To the other half, I don't. And I tell them that they are actually all requesting rides, right, in the same location. Now, I asked the people who got the discount, what is your likelihood, right, to pick a ride, to order a ride when you're faced with such a large discount? And the answer is obvious. You are going to be more likely to request a ride because now it's way more convenient for you to do so. Well, now I move to the other half of the class and I say, now you are requesting rides. How many cars are going to be available for you to be driven to the places where you want to go? The first group is going to deplete all the supply, leading to a reduction in the availability of cars for the second group. That reduction is going to push the probability to request a ride lower. And so the first group is interfering with the ability of the second group to actually request a ride. And that creates a bias in the difference in the propensity of the two groups to request a ride that is induced by this interaction. And that makes it much clearer. The students don't have to go back home and go and understand what SUTVA means. They have a very intuitive understanding of what that problem is.
Such a great example. So I'm wondering, to close out this segment on the Uber case study, I'm wondering, just for business leaders listening, what are some practical ways they can apply the lessons from your Uber case study, you think, to foster better collaboration between technical and managerial teams?
Yes. So I think data science is fundamentally admitting that you as a manager may not have all the answers. And so you really need to be able to formulate hypotheses so that you can test them with data on what would be the best product value that you could deliver to your customer. Concretely, right? Think about a world in which taxis, right, have to decide about making people walk to a taxi station or wait, right, on the phone while ordering a taxi, right? That world is one in which those taxi locations, those stations where you go pick up the taxi or you wait, those decisions around those parameters were made by the louder person in the room, not in a data-driven way. When you instead move to Uber, the louder voice in the room is the voice of the people, of the team that actually looks at the data and tries to make sense of what their customers actually choose as a function of the different sets of parameters they were given. And so really, that is the biggest takeaway from this case. Don't listen to the loudest person in the room. Make sure that everybody has a common understanding of what the data tell you, what the data cannot tell you, right? For example, your Duncan's quote earlier, right? This was an experiment just from Boston. We need to make sure to what extent can be generalized from other cities so that you can make the best decision.
Yeah, and I love that you've once again indexed on what the data can tell you, what it can't tell you. It reminds me that you mentioned earlier, having business leaders who know when to say, I don't know the answer. And side note, I actually just recorded an interview for this series with Michael Jordan from Berkeley. And one thing that we really dove into is the lack of current large language models' ability to express uncertainty or lack of knowledge in any way. How they'll take you around in circles. And I'm sure this is something you've experienced as well. We've been talking about data in some of the really big, sophisticated tech companies. But there's a whole long tail of, for lack of a better term, traditional industries that have adopted data strategies, quote unquote, for lack of a better term, to varying degrees of success. And you've spoken and written about how traditional companies struggle to adopt data science and analytics effectively. So I'm wondering what you see as the biggest barriers to these types of data transformations in
these industries and how they can overcome them?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem is recognizing that this is a system-wide approach change. It's not just flipping a switch on, hiring a couple of data scientists that now all of a sudden can solve all the problems that the company has. But you need really to be able to invest in technology, in people, and in processes. And for that to occur, you need to have the buy-in from the entire organization, and in particular from the top management. So what does it mean to invest in technology, people, and processes? Well, spend a lot of money in changing sort of the fragmented data infrastructure that is characteristics of many companies. I studied the accommodations market in the past. Starwood and Marriott merged together. It took them years to merge their loyalty programs because they were created with two very customized systems that couldn't talk to one another. And so really you need to have the patience to be able to do that transformation. You need to invest in people, and invest in people, not just hire a couple data scientists, but actually hire product managers that are able to work with data scientists, right? Back to some of the analogies that we made before, if the product managers are unwilling to admit that they don't know, that they need data, that they need other experts to help them make decisions, that's going to be a failure. And finally, processes, right? People need to be able to constantly look at data, maybe with dashboards, and not just data that get pushed to them, but data that they can investigate themselves in very intuitive way. And I think any company can do that transformation in principle, but it's very hard to pull that off in a very effective way.
Yeah, and actually, some of the most successful companies I've seen attempting to establish data initiatives, and to your point, definitely you need it top down. You need everyone aligned at the top. Without that, you're done. Some form of unified tooling, I think, is important. If everyone's using even Metabase or something like that, for example, some of the most successful people I've seen in organizations adopting data transformations are like customer success people who learn a bit of SQL and start jumping into the database and realize what's happening, or BDRs, business development representatives who know a bit and they can figure out which leads are the hottest and that type of stuff. I also, an old friend of mine, Angela Bassa, who when she was at, what's the company that makes the Roomba?
iRobot?
Yeah, so she ran data at iRobot up in Massachusetts, and they used to have like fortnightly data parties where they'd like order pizza, and it'd be like a little get together after work. The data team would show everyone how to interact with the data and that type of stuff. I suppose that dovetails nicely into kind of I wanted your thoughts on next. Something we're talking around is how to build a data culture, because it is something cultural. You've written about and talked about how many traditional companies want to become more data driven, but not sure exactly what that means. How should they think about building a data culture, and what roles do you think leaders need to play in this transformation?
Yeah. So I have one example, which is of a company I wrote a case on. This is an Italian company called Telepass. It was nothing more than a payment solution for toll plazas. I don't know how familiar you are with like Easy Pass, but many of us who drive around the US and need to pay tolls have a unit attached to their cars that allow them to track payments that then get charged to your debit card automatically. Telepass was exactly that in Italy. So couldn't be more traditional, right? They had a monopoly until a few years ago. And so they didn't really need to innovate. When that monopoly was taken away from them, they started actually worrying about potential alternatives and potential innovations. And they started thinking about themselves as not just a unit that tracks the car movement in toll plazas, but more as a mobility platform. And it actually, the push came from the very top, from the CEO at the time, Gabriele Benedetto, who kept on quoting Jim Barksdale, the former CEO and president of Netscape, that once said, if we have data, let's look at the data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. And so
That's
he
great.
kept reminding people of that old, the old approach of opinions and the new approach of data. And that allowed for the company to really start seeing themselves as a mobility platform, really start seeing themselves as an aggregator of consumer behavior data about all that is about mobility. They see, right, where you pay the highway by adding parking payment solutions, by adding other payment solutions for other transportation needs. They see how often you use the car relative to public transportation, relative to the trains, for example. They can start thinking about your risk as a driver, and all of a sudden they open up the opportunities to sell insurance,
Mhm.
right? Car insurance, because they know exactly at what speed you go on average in the highway. They know where you go. They know how often you use the car. And so really that opens up a whole new world of using the data you have to provide even more value to consumers. But you need the push from the top. When that stops, the transformation stops.
I'm going to link to this case study in the show notes. I love it for so many reasons. One of the reasons I love it, and I suppose it's a detail, but the fact that Benedetto, who you said became CEO, right?
Mhm.
That he was a consultant first, and he came in and he said, "Hey, everyone, do you realize you're actually a fintech? Do you
Yes.
realize you think you do all these things, but you're actually a fintech company?" And I love that story. The other thing I find fascinating, we probably shouldn't get into this too much now, but the idea of selling personalized insurance, and we're going down the route societally, in the West at least, of like more and more tailored personalized insurance, kind of feels like antithetical to classical ideas of insurance, which are about pooling risk, not like personalizing. If you personally have all these risks, it's about taking on risks together as a collective, I think.
I love that. And actually, in some contexts, right, pulling risk is really key, and health insurance is absolutely one of them. And in the US, there's the effort of many insurances to cherry pick on the healthiest individuals. When it comes to car insurance, clearly there's some adverse selection. Some drivers are
Yeah, yeah.
just worse than others, but there's also what we call moral hazard, right? If given the opportunity, some drivers become worse than others, right?
Mm.
And so, a way in which insurance companies can actually help is by creating the incentives while protecting, right, for accidents, but creating the incentives to drive safely. And a competitive market, I agree with you, is risky for pulling risks. But when you have moral hazard problems, actually being able to offer better insurance premia, lower insurance premia to the safer drivers may actually lead some risky drivers to become safer.
Makes perfect sense. And yeah, those type of making sure those type of incentive systems are correct is super important. And one thing I do want everyone to read this, because I also love that you're an expat from Italy originally, and it must have been wonderful to be able to do this case study, which is about Italy, and even some of it's almost novelistic the way you describe Italians' relationships with cars as they grow up, and how important it is as a rite of passage to adulthood is getting your car, and these types of things is absolutely fascinating. I do want to think a bit more before we wrap up about the role of managers in data science projects. So I'm just wondering how managers can better contribute to data science projects without needing to understand all the technical details. What do you think is the most important mindset shift that managers need to make?
I think we've talked about this a little bit earlier. The biggest shift is that you need to have joint decision making, right? They can't come up with their own ideas and stick with them, but actually share decision making with other figures, other roles in their organization, and share decision making between judgment and data driven insights. What this means, though, I think it's going to allow managers to do their job better. So let me give a concrete example about customer segmentation. We have cases on identifying the profitability and the various characteristics of different customer segments. Customer segments traditionally were created by identifying personas, right? That a manager would say, okay, I am a company selling baby wipes, and there's at least two personas: the busy parent who just needs something really quick, and the very sort of devoted, not that the busy parents are not devoted, but like the parents who really devote their time taking care of the kids. And those are maybe the two personas. Now data allow managers to create a variety of data-driven personas. And unsupervised machine learning, like cluster analysis, is going to allow you to create different customer groups that you wouldn't have otherwise thought of. And so this opens up opportunities to create even better value that weren't available before. But you need to shift the approach from I'm going to decide who the personas are to I'm going to let the data speak as to who the personas are.
And of course, sometimes when you do unsupervised learning cluster analysis, you actually see personas or subjects. So, for example, if you take a subset of the Wikipedia corpus and do some form of cluster analysis on it, you will see history and geography and these types of topics emerge, right, as clusters. So it validates as well.
Exactly. So some of those results are going to validate exactly what you've thought of. Some of those results may invalidate some of the personas that you may have created, right? And then would generate some of new personas, right?
Yeah.
You can think of these as a 2x2 matrix: the personas that you created versus the personas that the ML algorithm created. And there's going to be a certain overlap, but there's going to be some non-overlap. And that's where maybe the value can come from.
Yeah, great. So to wrap up, I'd love to think about the future of data science education for managers. I think looking forward, how do you see the role of data science education? And by data, I want to think like expansively. So data, machine learning, AI, all of these things, right? How do you see data education evolving for business leaders? Will it become a fundamental part of management training?
I'm confident it will, not just the teaching of data science, artificial intelligence, but the use of data science and artificial intelligence to teach other more traditional subjects like finance and accounting. We are already seeing it at HBS, where many of our courses in the required curriculum have created bots, right, to help students navigate the material in accounting, for example, much more efficiently. Because our students come from very different places with very different levels of expertise on each of these courses. And a one-size-fits-all approach is just not very effective, right? And in the class, inevitably, the instructor is going to adopt a one-size-fits-all approach with 93, 94 students in the classroom. That's about the size of our sections at HBS. And so that level of personalization can come from bots across many of the disciplines that we teach. Now, when it comes to teaching data science and AI, for the purpose of teaching data science and AI, I am also sure it's going to stay, and it's going to become even easier to teach it because AI is reducing the cost of teaching that very technical knowledge to students and for anybody to gain some expertise. So I'm really excited about those opportunities, and it's a very fast changing environment. So every year we change our course quite dramatically, even the name of the course quite dramatically, but it'll stay.
Yeah, I've always thought that education needs to be relatively conservative in how it evolves. And what I mean by that is you want to model signal of what people need to know, right? You don't want to model noise. But when things are moving so quickly, how do you decide? I mean, it was several years ago that a lot of statistics and math departments in the US rebranded as data science. And I currently joke maybe data science was a 2010s phenomenon, and now it's the machine learning AI era, and they're the same departments but slightly different terms. So
that's really funny. Actually, if sorry if I interrupt you. Yesterday, the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded
machine learning
to John Hopfield and Jeff Hinton for
Yeah.
machine learning advances. So, you hit the right spot. But I also think that if we sit on our laurels and think that the curriculum that we had 10 years ago is still valid today, especially at the MBA level, right? That's the wrong approach. And we've done that actually for some time, I have to admit. That's the wrong approach, because our managers, we are hoping to give them tools that they will be able to use in the next 60 years, right, in their career. And with such a fast-pacing world, if we don't teach them to be flexibly learning about the new technology, we're doing them a disservice.
Absolutely. And to your point about the Nobel Prize for physics being won by people who being awarded to people who work in machine learning, I do. So to be clear, for anyone who doesn't know this, I've worked in physics, in biophysics, in physics of living matter. So I hope I'm allowed to say, I kind of joke, like, what does physics even do anymore? So, and I don't quite mean that. And a lot of my former colleagues and collaborators and friends may send me mean text messages now. But I think physics in the 20th century, for example, it was highly unreasonably successful at nearly everything it got applied to. And we may be seeing dips in the application of physics, not in technology, of course, and manufacturing and that type of stuff. So I do want to wrap up. We've talked about a lot of interesting things, and I'm wondering, for business leaders and data scientists listening, what's one key takeaway you'd want them to walk away from this conversation with about the intersection of data science and management?
Teamwork and sharing a common goal. Those are the things that hopefully we've discussed at length in our conversation today. Those are the two key things. Don't lose track of working in teams, and don't lose track that despite the different skill sets, when you're working in a team, you have a common goal.
Thank you so much, Chiara. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. And I want to thank you not only for your time and wisdom, but your generosity in having this conversation.
Thank you so much, Hugo. It was a real pleasure to be here with you today.
Likewise.
Thanks so much for listening to High Signal, brought to you by Delphina. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to sign up to our newsletter, follow us on YouTube, and share the podcast with your friends. All the links are in the show notes. We'll catch you next time.